The rain had been falling since dawn, soaking the sprawling gardens of the Hawthorne estate. The mansion, with its tall glass walls and polished marble floors, looked like a palace to an outsider, but inside, it was as quiet as a tomb. Maxwell Hawthorne, a man whose name dominated business magazines, sat at the head of the long oak dining table. His untouched coffee had gone cold. His eyes, sharp enough to scare boardroom rivals, now looked dull and heavy. Across from him, in a smaller chair, sat his son, Oliver. Oliver was 6. His blonde hair fell messily over his forehead. His small hands clutched the hem of his sweater. He didn't speak. He didn't look at his father. He didn't even look at the food in front of him. 9 months. 9 months since that night. 9 months since Oliver's voice had vanished. Maxwell still remembered that night in fragments. The screech of tires, the shattering of glass, the sound of Oliver screaming before it was swallowed by silence. The doctors had said Oliver was physically unharmed, but trauma was an invisible wound, and this wound had turned his bright, laughing boy into a silent shadow. Every therapist Maxwell had brought into the house left with the same hopeless expression. Every attempt at play, conversation, or coaxing failed. Oliver's world was locked behind an invisible wall, and no one could reach him. That morning, Maxwell's assistant had reminded him of something he barely cared about. "Sir, the new maid is starting today. She comes highly recommended by the agency. Says she's good with children." Maxwell had only nodded. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered. Elena arrived at precisely 9 a.m. She was in her mid-20s, with long dark hair tied neatly, wearing a crisp uniform and a simple white headband. Her eyes carried a warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold grandeur of the house. She stood in the entrance hall, clutching a small bag. Maxwell gave her a short nod. "Your duties are simple," he said curtly. "Keep the house in order. Meals, laundry, cleaning. Don't bother my son unless necessary." Elena's gaze shifted to the boy peeking from behind the staircase railing. Oliver. She didn't smile immediately. Instead, she knelt down, not too close, not too far. Her voice was soft, steady. "Hi there," she said, as though speaking to a frightened animal. "You must be Oliver." Oliver didn't respond. His eyes flickered for a second before darting away. Maxwell almost interrupted, but something about the way Elena stayed there, patiently, made him pause. She didn't push. She simply nodded, stood, and walked to the kitchen. For the first 2 days, Elena followed Maxwell's instructions, mostly. She kept the house spotless, prepared meals, and moved silently through the halls. But Maxwell noticed something. Wherever Oliver was, she seemed to pass by. Not stopping, not intruding, but leaving little traces. A small plate of cookies near his playroom door. A set of colored pencils arranged neatly on the coffee table. A music box left half open in the hallway. It was on the 3rd day that Maxwell saw something unusual. He'd returned early from a meeting, briefcase in hand, when he heard a sound he hadn't heard in months. Not a voice, not yet, but a giggle. Faint, almost like a memory. He followed the sound to the living room, and there she was, Elena, crawling on the floor like some kind of mischievous creature, her white headband tilted to one side, the boy riding on her back like a knight on a horse. Oliver's tiny hands were in the air, and though no words came from his mouth, his face was lit with the kind of smile Maxwell thought he'd never see again. For a moment, Maxwell simply stood in the doorway, stunned. He felt something in his chest, something sharp and warm, like the first sunlight after winter. Oliver's eyes caught his, and just like that, the smile vanished. The boy slid off Elena's back, stepped away, and retreated behind the couch, silent again. The air shifted. Elena slowly got to her feet, brushing her hair back. "I'm sorry, sir," she said softly. "I know you said not to." Maxwell raised a hand. "No, don't apologize." His voice was quieter than usual. What were you doing?" Her lips curved into a faint smile. "Just trying to remind him what laughter feels like." Maxwell looked toward the couch where his son hid, his small frame trembling slightly. "It's not that simple," he muttered. Elena's eyes didn't waver. Maybe not. But sometimes, it starts with something simple. That night, Maxwell found himself unable to work. His mind kept returning to that tiny giggle, the sound of Oliver's face lighting up. It was fragile, fleeting, but it was something. And deep inside, for the first time in 9 months, Maxwell felt a dangerous thing he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Hope. A week later, Elena asked for something unusual. "I'd like to take him outside," she said one morning, tying her hair back. Maxwell frowned. "He doesn't go outside." "That's the problem," Elena replied gently. "Sometimes, you have to change the scenery to change the story." He almost said no. But the memory of that smile, and the way Oliver's hand had lingered on her shoulder that day, made him hesitate. And so, without fully knowing why, Maxwell found himself watching from the window as Elena led Oliver into the garden, his small hand clutching hers. For the first time in months, the boy wasn't hiding, and Maxwell, gripping the curtain, felt something shift. Something big was coming. The garden was a quiet, private stretch of land. Manicured hedges, marble statues, and a pond where white lilies floated like pieces of the sky. But to Oliver, it might as well have been another planet. He stood still at the edge of the path, his tiny fingers still gripping Elena's hand. His eyes darted toward the pond, then the tall hedges, then the sky. He didn't speak, but his breathing was faster, as if the openness scared him. Elena crouched beside him. "You're safe," she said softly. "No cars, no loud noises, just us." Maxwell watched from the upstairs balcony, holding a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. He had expected Oliver to cling to her and refuse to move, but instead, after a long pause, the boy took one small step forward, then another. They walked slowly toward the pond. Elena pointed to the water lilies, her voice calm but animated. "These flowers only open in the daylight," she told him. "They close when it's dark, like they're sleeping." Oliver's gaze fixed on the white petals. His lips parted, not to speak, but in a quiet kind of wonder. Elena bent down, picked a small pebble, and dropped it gently into the pond. The ripples spread out in circles. "See that? That's what happens when something touches the water. It makes waves." She offered him another pebble. First, he only stared at it. Then, slowly, his small fingers took it from her hand. He dropped it into the pond. His eyes followed the ripples. Up on the balcony, Maxwell's throat tightened. It wasn't much, just a boy dropping a stone into a pond. But it was engagement. It was participation. For 9 months, Oliver hadn't engaged with anyone. And now, this young maid was somehow drawing him out. Pebble by pebble, ripple by ripple. Over the next few weeks, Elena wove herself into Oliver's silent world like a thread of color into gray fabric. She learned he loved drawing, though he wouldn't start unless she sketched something first. She discovered he had a soft spot for strawberry jam, so she made it from scratch, just to see the faint lift of his mouth when he tasted it. She realized he hated thunderstorms, so on stormy nights, she would sit outside his room, humming softly until he fell asleep. Maxwell noticed it all. He told himself he was simply keeping an eye on his employee. But the truth was, he was watching because he didn't understand how she was doing it. One evening, he found them in the library. Elena was lying on the carpet, a book open beside her. Oliver was next to her, his tiny body curled toward hers as he drew on a sheet of paper. She was telling him a story in a low, rhythmic voice, about a small fox who had lost his way in the forest but found a friend who helped him home. Maxwell stood in the doorway for a long time before Elena looked up. "You're home early," she said. "I didn't want to stay at the office," he admitted, surprising himself. She smiled faintly, then nodded toward Oliver's drawing. "He drew the fox today. I think he likes the story." Maxwell crouched down beside them. "Can I see?" he asked his son. Oliver didn't move. His eyes flicked to Maxwell's face for a second, then back to the drawing. But he didn't push the paper away. It was the smallest allowance, but it was more than Maxwell had gotten in months. A few nights later, Maxwell heard something that froze him mid-step in the hallway. It was Oliver's voice. Not a word. Not even a full sound. Just a single, high-pitched hum, like the first note of a song drifting from the kitchen. He followed the sound and found Oliver standing on a stool, wearing a tiny apron, while Elena stirred a bowl of cake batter. The boy's lips were curved slightly upward, and his throat released another small hum as he dropped a handful of chocolate chips into the mix. Elena looked up, saw Maxwell in the doorway, and gave a small, silent shake of her head, a plea not to interrupt. Maxwell stayed there, rooted, his heart pounding. It wasn't speech yet, but it was music, and music meant something was breaking through. Later that night, after Oliver had gone to bed, Maxwell stopped Elena in the hallway. "How are you doing this?" he asked, his voice low. "He hasn't spoken in 9 months. The doctors, they couldn't." Elena met his gaze evenly. "I'm not a doctor. I'm just listening to the silences. They tell you a lot if you're patient." He studied her for a long moment. "You've worked with children before?" She hesitated, just for a second, then nodded. "Yes, but this is different." Something in her tone told him there was more to that story, but before he could ask, she excused herself. The breakthrough came one bright afternoon. Elena had convinced Oliver to try a new game. She tied a scarf around her head, crawled on the carpet, and pretended to be a mountain for him to climb. Oliver giggled, that same pure sound Maxwell had heard weeks ago. From the doorway, Maxwell watched, his chest tight. Then, without warning, Oliver looked up at Elena and whispered something so faint, Maxwell almost thought he imagined it. One word. A name. Maxwell froze. It wasn't Elena's name. It wasn't his. It was a name he hadn't heard since the accident. Elena's expression shifted, not to surprise, but to a kind of deep, aching understanding. She leaned closer to Oliver and whispered back, "I know." And in that moment, Maxwell realized. She knew exactly what had happened 9 months ago. Like a punch. Daniel. Maxwell hadn't heard that name in months. He hadn't allowed himself to. Daniel was the driver who had been with them the night of the accident. A young man who had worked for Maxwell for only 6 months before tragedy struck. It had been raining hard that night. Maxwell had been in the back seat, taking a call. Oliver sat strapped in beside him. Then the sudden screech of tires. A blinding light. The sickening crunch of metal. When Maxwell came to, the car was upside down. Oliver was screaming, and Daniel was gone. No one knew if he had jumped out, been thrown, or... Maxwell shut his eyes, forcing the memory back into its locked box. But now, 9 months later, his son's first word was the name of the man who had vanished that night. Maxwell waited until Oliver had gone upstairs before stepping into the living room where Elena was putting away the game pieces. "You knew him," he said flatly. Elena's hands paused over the toy box. "Knew who?" "Daniel," Maxwell said. "My son just spoke his name for the first time in 9 months. And you didn't look surprised. You looked like you understood." For a long moment, Elena said nothing. Then she set the toys down and stood up. "Yes," she said finally. "I knew him. He was my brother." Maxwell's breath caught. "Your brother? He was everything to me," she said quietly. "We grew up with nothing. He worked 2 jobs to put me through school. When he got the job here, he told me it was the first time he felt like his life was turning around." Maxwell felt the ground tilt beneath him. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because I didn't want the job out of pity," Elena replied. "And because I wasn't ready to see this house. The last place my brother was alive." She sat on the edge of the couch, her voice low but steady. "After the accident, they told me the official report, that the other car ran the red light, that there wasn't time to stop. But what they didn't tell you, Mr. Hawthorne, is that in his last moments, Daniel shielded Oliver with his own body. That's why your son is alive." Maxwell stared at her, stunned. He had never known. The doctors had said Oliver had no major injuries, just bruises. He had assumed it was luck. But now, Elena's eyes shimmered. "I think Oliver remembers. Not in full, not clearly, but enough to remember Daniel's face. And losing him the way he did, It's why he shut down. He's not just afraid of cars or noise. He's afraid of losing people. The words sat heavy in the air. Maxwell had always thought of trauma as fear of an event. He hadn't considered that it could be fear of absence. That night, Maxwell couldn't sleep. He found himself pacing the halls, hearing Daniel's name in his head over and over. He remembered the boyish grin Daniel always had, the way he'd buckle Oliver's seatbelt twice just to be sure. And he remembered the funeral, closed casket, Elena standing in the back with her hands clenched, eyes dry not because she didn't care, but because grief had hollowed her out. He'd barely spoken to her that day. Now she was here in his house, somehow pulling Oliver back toward the world. And she was doing it not just as a maid, but as a sister keeping her brother's last promise. The change in Oliver became more visible after that. Some mornings, he'd wait by the kitchen doorway before breakfast, holding his sketchbook, as if waiting for Elena to notice. She always did. Some afternoons, they'd sit by the pond, and instead of only watching, Oliver would hand her pebbles to drop in the water, a silent invitation to share the ripples. Maxwell started joining them sometimes. At first, he sat awkwardly on the bench, feeling like an intruder. But gradually, Oliver began to let him hand over the pebbles, too. They were small victories, but to Maxwell they felt monumental. Then came the day that changed everything. It was late afternoon, the sun low and golden, spilling through the living room windows. Elena had been chasing Oliver around the carpet, pretending to be a wild horse, while he clung to her back, laughing silently. Maxwell had just stepped into the doorway, his briefcase still in hand, when it happened. Oliver saw him, and instead of retreating, instead of shutting down, he stayed on Elena's back. His arms lifted in the air. His lips moved. Maxwell's breath caught. He heard it. Papa. One word. Fragile. Trembling. But clear. Maxwell's briefcase slid from his hand and hit the floor. Elena stopped crawling, her eyes darting to his. For a second, no one moved. Then Maxwell crossed the room in 2 strides and dropped to his knees. Oliver was looking at him. Not through him. Not past him. At him. Papa, Oliver whispered again. Maxwell pulled him into his arms, holding him so tightly he was afraid he might crush him. His chest shook with a sound he hadn't made in years. A sob. Over Oliver's shoulder, his eyes met Elena's. She wasn't smiling. She was crying too. Quiet, steady tears. Maxwell realized, in that moment, that whatever debt he thought he owed Daniel, he would spend the rest of his life repaying it to his son. And maybe to Elena too. For the next few days, the air inside the Hawthorne mansion felt different. It wasn't that Oliver suddenly became talkative. Far from it. But after that Papa, something in him had shifted. He no longer avoided his father's gaze. He no longer shrank when Maxwell entered the room. And the silences felt less heavy. Elena kept her approach the same, patient, playful, steady. She didn't try to force words out of him. Instead, she created moments where words could choose to appear. One afternoon, she found Maxwell in his study, staring at a contract without reading it. "You should come outside," she said. "Oliver wants to show you something." Maxwell followed her to the garden. Oliver was by the pond, crouched low, watching the water lilies sway. Beside him sat a small paper boat, hand-painted with clumsy strokes of red and blue. When Maxwell approached, Oliver glanced up, and instead of looking away, he held out the boat. "For you," he said softly. Maxwell froze. The words were quiet, hesitant, but they were voluntary. He took the boat with careful hands, his throat too tight to speak. Later that evening, Elena lingered in the hallway as Maxwell tucked Oliver into bed. The boy clutched a small stuffed fox, a new gift from Elena, tied to the story she'd told him weeks ago. Maxwell sat at the edge of the bed, smoothing Oliver's hair. "I'm proud of you," he said. "More than you'll ever know." Oliver's eyes fluttered. But before he drifted off, he whispered, "I miss Daniel." Maxwell's chest ached. He glanced toward the doorway, where Elena stood, her eyes glistening. "I do too," Maxwell said quietly. "Every day." A week later, Elena suggested something bold. There's a children's park not far from here, she said over breakfast. I think it's time he saw other kids. Maxwell hesitated. He hasn't been around strangers since. I know, Elena interrupted gently. But part of healing is learning the world isn't always dangerous. And I'll be with him. Maxwell looked at his son, who was quietly buttering his toast. What do you think, Oliver? Oliver didn't answer right away. Then, with a small nod, he whispered, Okay. The day was bright and warm. At the park, the sound of laughter and the creak of swings filled the air. Oliver stayed close to Elena at first, watching other children run and climb. Then, slowly, he wandered toward the sandbox. A little girl handed him a shovel. He took it. From the bench, Maxwell and Elena watched as Oliver began to dig, then build a small mound, then, to Maxwell's surprise, laugh when it collapsed. It wasn't a quiet giggle. It was a real laugh. Maxwell turned to Elena. You did this, he said, his voice low. She shook her head. No, he did. I just reminded him how. On the way home, Oliver dozed in the back seat. Maxwell drove, and Elena sat beside the boy, her hand resting lightly on his small shoulder. At a red light, Maxwell glanced in the rearview mirror. Elena, I never thanked you. Not properly. You don't have to, she said. Yes, I do, he replied. Daniel saved my son's life that night. But you gave him his life back. For a moment, Elena's eyes met his in the mirror. I think Daniel would have wanted that. That evening, after dinner, Oliver surprised them both. He padded into the living room, holding the paper boat Maxwell had kept on his desk. Without a word, he walked to the pond outside and set it gently on the water. Maxwell knelt beside him. What's this, buddy? Oliver's voice was steady. It's for Daniel. So he knows I'm okay now. Maxwell's eyes blurred. He wrapped an arm around his son, pulling him close. Elena stood a few feet away, her hands clasped in front of her, tears slipping down her cheeks. The little boat drifted away, carried by ripples, until it was just a speck in the golden light of the setting sun. And in that moment, the mansion no longer felt like a tomb, felt like a home again. In the days that followed, Oliver's words came more easily. Not a flood, just a steady trickle. Enough to tell Maxwell he loved him. Enough to ask Elena for strawberry jam. Enough to laugh when the wild horse came trotting into the living room again. And though Daniel was gone, his love lived on. In the boy who could now face the world, and in the maid who had kept her brother's last promise. Maxwell knew one thing for certain. They had all been broken in their own ways. But together they were whole again.